This right here is probably all you need to know about Rance, the superhero here to save the day. Hey everyone, Zirin here, and since Manga Gamer finally finished the translation of Rance 1 and the Rance 2 remake, I thought I'd give my thoughts on this one. I've already talked about the Rance 1 remake with my visual novel primer format way back in the day, so if you want to know more about that one, I'll just link down the top right corner right about now. Anyways, let's get back into talk about Rance 2, Rebellious Maidens. This game was the first Rance remake to ever come out way back in 2009 with Alisoft 2010, which is essentially a collection of fan discs and really tiny games by Alisoft. Had stuff like Choco sending Haruka, Haruka vs Escalea, crossover fan disc, and so on. Perhaps it's because it was their first attempt at remaking one of the entries of their flagship series, but they went pretty tame on making the game system for Rance 2. Making it probably the most straightforward one out of the entire modern series, before they changed things up with Rance 5D. Along with being one of the most straightforward games in the series, the combat itself is also incredibly simple as well, which I will say isn't necessarily a bad thing. If you are someone who found the Rance series to be kinda hard overall, or perhaps somewhat difficult to play through, then this one should come across as a pleasant surprise, I suppose. Although Manga Gamer finally released their own translation, I'm just gonna talk about it using the janky old English translation and the Japanese version, because I am way too lazy to play through the entirety of Rance 2 again. Look, I'm a huge fan of this series, and you all know that, but I also always try to be as honest as possible, and I'm gonna be perfectly blunt here, I think Rance 2 is a fairly weak entry overall, and unlike the other remakes, Alisoft plays this one incredibly tame without really updating much. Manga Gamer says that their translation is based on Rance 2 Kai, because Alisoft 2010 supposedly contains 2 different editions of Rance 2. This part I had to look over again because I wasn't entirely sure what version I had initially played way back when, and of which I'll be using as a basis for this look at Rance 2. Searching online, I found a change list that details every change they made for all the different versions of Rance 2, and from there I found that essentially the Kai they were referring to is a patch they released with the game, and they are probably using the Kai edition. The only thing that really changes are a few gameplay features such as, we included stronger medicine, or we threw out the completely useless companion talk section and replaced it with a hint section. Basically, a bunch of minor fixes that don't really change the experience as a whole. As for the claims of a completely rewritten script, I have no idea. I played the Japanese Kai edition, but since I haven't played the original, there's not much for me to compare it to, and besides the fact, the script I did look at seems entirely serviceable. As for the Manga Gamer translation, since I'm not actually playing the translation, I'm not going to comment on it. Manga Gamer, while sometimes the editing can be a little overall, it usually turns out to be pretty fine, and I'm gonna assume that's the case here as well. Normally, I would go into the background of the Rance series, but again, I've already done a huge video on the whole retrospective of the series, so you can go ahead and check that out if you're curious. Link in the top right corner. Alright, so let's finally get to talking about Rance 2 itself. The story is, again, nothing too special. I mentioned this in the Rance series overview I did earlier, but in my opinion, the Rance series story-wise doesn't really hit its stride until Rance 3. As this is before that, Rance 2 is fairly simple. It's essentially just an adventure revolving around Rance and Sil confronting the eponymous Rebellious Maidens, the 4 disciples of Ragus who apparently have rebelled against him after 10 years of training, and the resulting battle has sealed away the town of Custom. Rance comes bouncing along to save the day, and yeah, that's pretty much it. You later find out that each maiden has a ring that increases their power but twists their personality, and the only way to remove it is by boning the ladies because of course that's the case. As I mentioned earlier, the gameplay is very straightforward. You run around interacting with the NPCs, exhausting all of their dialogue options until you can continue with the story. Navigating maps is done in a manner very similar to Rance 4, where you move through maps, moving around until you hit another NPC to exhaust their dialogue. Sometimes while moving around, you run into random encounters or forced battles. The battle system in this game is the most bog standard RPG you can imagine. While you have 1 to 2 party members at any given point, you only control your main character Rance, while everyone else is on autopilot. Battles basically boil down to keep on attacking and special attacking until the enemy is dead, and occasionally using items to heal if your partner is out of MP. That's pretty much it. Rance 2 is definitely not a hard game at all. As long as you stock up on healing items, battles are just straightforward slugfests. The reason it's so brain dead is because Rance only has like 3 moves essentially. Attack, stronger attack, and the insto command, which you will need to use maybe like 3 times throughout the entirety of the game. Honestly, I found it really boring. I think one of the greatest features about the later entries in the Rance series is the level of challenge they are willing to throw at the player, and that just doesn't really exist here. Now, to be fair, many of the early Rance games are pretty bad in the gameplay department. I think Rance 1 to 4.2 all have really bad archaic gameplay that isn't really fun to go through. Later remakes like Rance 01 and Rance 03 spice things up by actually revamping the gameplay entirely. However, as Rance 02 is the first one, they seem to have played it pretty safe by just making it an updated version, which doesn't really make for a great experience, honestly. The reason why I look so fondly back on Rance 3 and Rance 4 still, even though they are absolutely ancient, is that the story still shines through even if they are held back by pretty bad gameplay. Rance 02 doesn't really have that, where the story is honestly not very exciting, and the gameplay is fairly weak even with the updates given to it. With all I have said about Rance 2, you might assume that I am insinuating that you should just skip this entry, but surprisingly it's not that cut and dry. If you are looking to get into the Rance series for the first time, then yeah, I don't think you should play Rance 2 as your starting point. I think Rance 6, and Goku Rance, Rance 9, and even the Rance 1 and 3 remakes are all much better games to really give you a good first impression. However, if you are someone who enjoys Rance and wants to experience the entire series, then Rance 2 is definitely an important entry to cover. Not because what occurs in the story actually matters in the grand scheme of things. Regis, the Master Mage, and the Town of Custom are both entirely unimportant and don't really get mentioned outside of Rance 2, but rather because some of the characters introduced in Rance 2 become mainstays similar to Konami, who will appear time and time again in practically every single subsequent entry. So getting to witness their first meeting with our main protagonist Rance is in my opinion worth playing the Rance 02 remake purely on that fact alone. Of course, I'm referring to Maria and Shizuka, both of whom we will see and team up with in nearly every future installment. The other 2 witches, Miru and Eleanor, we will see later as well, but don't quite reach main party status like the other 2. Rance 02 is also the first time we get to see Bardo and Fetus, both of whom become fairly important throughout the series as well. As for some other factors to appreciate about Rance 02, I think the whole story element with Bird acting as the foil to Rance as the standard nice guy adventurer as opposed to Rance's outright obvious selfishness is done alright, especially when you reach the section where you play as Syl and team up with Bird for a portion of the game, and you get to see him and Syl interact. While it was fairly obvious even in Rance 1, it's still nice to see that even when Syl is given the option to get away from Rance and his crazy antics, she truly does care for him and firmly rebuffs Birdie's advances. Millie Yorks, even though I don't really mention her, is a super fun character as well, a female knight who completely dominates Rance in bed, and well, that really isn't something you get to see very often in this series. She however isn't too important in later entries, as she sadly ends up passing away partway through the series outside of the games due to an illness. As for Maria's first appearance, I gotta say, not a fan of the ceremonial white dress thing she has going on. Maria falls in love with Rance at first sight, which admittedly I have absolutely no idea how the heck that comes about, but I guess it's nice to see someone who just straight likes him. Uesugi Kenshin is similar, but I suppose her much more blunt proclamation of love without any shyness or frills gets a much funnier reaction out of Rance than Maria, who is too shy to tell him outright. Shizuka is, Shizuka. She acts exactly the same way as she does later in the series, although perhaps a bit more antagonistically, only reluctantly joining Rance due to Maria and the shared interests. So yeah, that's Rance 02, the Rebellious Maidens remake. Surprisingly, even though I think as a standalone game, Rance 02 isn't anything too special, if you're sort of looking to experience the entirety of the Rance series, I think Rance 02 is worth playing purely on the basis of meeting Maria, Shizuka, Birdie, and Felis for the first time. If you are however looking to experience Rance for the first time, there are again better entries to try out first. If you enjoyed what you saw, the like button is there as always, subscribe if you want to support me, and notification all buttons to keep up to date on when the next video comes out. Honestly, this wasn't the video I had planned, but Manga Gamer suddenly released their translation of Rance 01 and Rance 02 out of nowhere, so I decided to just work on this one instead. The video I have been working on will instead be coming out next week, so look forward to that.